Bonjour, welcome to Wahsa Distance Education Center's radio Zoom classes. This is SVN3E, grade 11 workplace science, and I am Bronwyn Slade. If you'd like to participate live today, you can call the Wahsa studio at 1-800-465-7144 or 737-4017. You can listen on the radio at 91.9 FM or on the television at Bell Express View channel 972. You're always welcome to join me live on the Zoom link, which is available from me, your teacher, and also your DEC. Our classes are scheduled Monday through Thursday from 3 till 4 in the afternoon, and we are wrapping up our 4th week of our 9-week course. At this point, you should be submitting work for marking. So the key questions are listed at the end of each of your IL lesson. So you need to do all of them. Some of them are check your understanding questions. There are a few activities, and then the other ones are review questions. So please show all of your work, your steps, and your thinking, making sure that you're actually answering the question and not just talking about on the topic. You can do this by hand or electronically. If you want to write in your workbook, feel free. It's yours to keep, so you can write in it if you want. There isn't a lot of space, but you do what works for you. If you are going to type it up, Word and Google Docs are the easiest files for me to access. Everyone has access to Google Docs through their NNEC email address, so I can support you to figure that out if that works well for you. If you're going to use another file or another file type, that is probably fine. Just let me know so that we can make sure that I can open your files. There are 3 methods for submitting your work for marking. The first is to scan your work in and send it electronically. So if you have written it out by hand, you can scan using a smartphone, either using the iPhone Notes app or the Android Google Drive app. Both have scan functions. If that doesn't work for you, you can also just take a picture and send that to me as well. That's totally fine. And you can send it by email to studentwork@nnec.on.ca and CC it to bronwyn.slate@nnec.on.ca, or you can send it to me through Facebook Messenger at bslatewahsa. The second method is to drop your work off into Lookout. So we have an outdoor mailbox at our location 74 Front Street. We're the bright red building next to the post office, and we have a small white mailbox next to our side entrance. We continue to be closed to the public, but you can just put it in there and I'll get it and get it back to you as soon as I can. The third method is to hand your work into your DEC. Your DEC can send your work through the Express or fax it to 807-737-1732 or toll-free fax to 1-800-463-7852. If you'd like to connect with me through social media, you can at Facebook and YouTube. My name there on both is B Slate Wahsa. Sorry. So you can find me there, and all of our lessons are recorded and then uploaded after airing to my YouTube channel, and then I share that on Facebook. So that's a great place to go and check out if you want to watch replays, if you want to see the diagrams again that I've shared, or if you want to watch the videos again that we've listened to in class. All of them are there through the playlist SVN3E on my YouTube channel, as well as there's a supplementary video list where the videos are listed. Science is really visual, so I would strongly encourage you to access the videos. You can always join me live through Zoom, even if you don't want to talk or don't ask questions. That's totally fine. You can still just watch and listen, or you can watch the replays on YouTube. If you don't have access to reliable internet for those options, just let me know and I can send you the recordings, and then you can still watch them and hopefully they will be helpful. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact me. My email address is bronwyn.slate@nnec.on.ca. My Facebook is B Slate Wahsa. My phone number is 807-737-1488, extension 2209, which I do currently have access to, so you can call and leave me a message and I will get it. You can also call us toll free at 1-800-667-3703. My office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., though I do teach from 9 till 10 and 3 to 4, so those times I will not be available, but you can send me a message and then I'll get back to you the rest of the day. All right, I'd like to start our class off with my positionality in terms of recognizing how I view science and learning as that's shaped by who I am and how I grew up. So I have white settler ancestry, I have white privilege, and that definitely shapes the way that I walk in the world, the way that I am approached in terms of education and how I understand within science. So that colors the way that I teach as well. I live in Northwestern Ontario on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe people, and I'm attempting to learn from their teachings and their culture in order to honor that and recognize that within our learning of science. I think that's really important to do, but it's something that I have to learn as an outsider. Also, this is my first time teaching this course, so I do have lots to learn and unlearn. Yeah, it's a process. It's a lifelong process always whenever you're a teacher that you're constantly learning and unlearning. But this being my first time teaching this course, there is a little bit of a wider breadth of knowledge that I need to work on. Also, our textbook is Eurocentric. I've noticed that it positions the European, the white perspective as scientists, and that ideal as sort of the norm, which isn't the whole truth. So it potentially could use problematic language. I haven't run into it yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if at some point there is. And I definitely does ignore Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis knowledges and experiences. So this is something that I work to integrate into our course as I'm teaching, so that we can recognize those experiences and wealth of knowledge outside of the European, the white perspective, because that's really, really important. Also, if there is anything that I'm doing incorrectly or there's anything that I'm missing and you'd like to encourage me and help me learn and do better, I'm happy to take that feedback. Just let me know. All right, so we are going to do a Throwback Thursday lesson today. We've covered a lot of material. We are almost halfway through the course, and we're almost halfway through both in terms of time and material. So we're going to review back over the whole course, but focusing specifically on lessons 6 through 10. But first, let's do a quick reminder of why we're reviewing already. Yes, we're halfway through the course, but we still have lots to go. So why are we spending time reviewing? There was research done by Hermann Ebbinghaus in 1885 that showed us that humans forget things fairly quickly. So this forgetting curve shows us that we forget things rapidly. Within one day of learning something, if we knew it at 100%, already within 24 hours or so, we've already forgotten 15% of that. And then as a whole week later, we're already forgotten 60%, and we're down to only knowing about 40%, retaining about 40% of that knowledge. So if we wait until the end of our course after 9 weeks and we haven't touched anything, we haven't looked back at any of the stuff that we taught in the earlier weeks, what is the chances that we're going to remember very much about that? We might be down to like 30% or so of remembering that. And that's not really going to set you up for success to actually learn the material and understand it and be able to use it in your life, but also isn't going to set you up for success for your final projects. So within that continuation of that study is that if we revisit our material, then not only do we retain more of it because we're revisiting it, so we're sort of filling ourselves back up to 100% of knowledge, but we also forget it slower. So it takes, after a couple of times of reviewing, then it might take us 3 or 4 times as long to forget the same amount as it did earlier on. So if we keep coming back to it, we're more likely to remember it longer and more of it. So this is why we review every week or two, in order to remember what we've been talking about and hopefully remember it and understand it for longer. All right, so the highlights of what we've covered so far in the course. So first, the Unit 1 highlights, which is what we've done at the very beginning of the course, and we have already reviewed. Where that lesson 1, we did components of soil, water, and air. So we talked about what they were actually made up of. So soil, we talked about that is made up of components of air, water, and minerals like sand, silt, and clay, and also organic materials. Water, we talked about how it is the universal solvent because of the chemical makeup of water. It dissolves a lot of other polar solutions. And then we also talked about the acids, bases, and pH scale in terms of understanding how the impact of if something is too acidic or too basic, and that whacks things out of balance in order that has an environmental impact in the long run. And then we talked about air and how air is actually made up of various gases. Many of us probably think of it just as oxygen, but that nitrogen makes up the majority of our air, as well as carbon and oxygen and other things as well. But those are the three that make up most of our air. And how does that cycle through our environments? Then we talked about lesson 2, which was the effects of human activity on the soil, water, and air. So we talked about within soil, deforestation, urbanization, erosion, chemical fertilizers and pesticides, industrial chemicals, and how they all destroy the soil, how they take out minerals, how they wash minerals away, how they break things down and make it so they're not useful for us or useful for the environment in general. We talked about how within water, recreational, industrial, and everyday activities pollute our water. So it's not just big business, but also things that we do consistently in our own lives. And then we talked about air and how burning of fossil fuels leads to air pollution and how that has an impact on the greenhouse gases and the greenhouse gas effect, which has resulted in detrimental effects on all of our living things within the climate crisis. Then the final lesson of Unit 1 was Lesson 3, where common methods of sampling and monitoring soil, water, and air. So we looked at how we know that we're having an impact on soil, water, and air. So we talked about core soil testing and soil profiles to understand the various layers and horizons of soil. We talked about sampling and testing of water, where we watched a video about taking water samples and how we are able to get deep below the surface as well as the surface of the water, how that's important. And we talked about boil water advisories and how those are throughout Canada, particularly in First Nation communities, and how that is inequitable and one of the climate injustices that is going on, and how that is an issue. And then we talked about air, where we talked about stack sampling and how the air quality index, how we measure the quality of our air and where it is more polluted and less polluted and safer to breathe. Then Unit 2. So first we looked at Lesson 4, the cycling of substances and ecosystems. So we just defined ecosystems and we focused particularly on the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers. So how the producers who are able to create their food and energy mostly from the sun and the nutrients around them. So that's mostly plants, both on land and in water. And then consumers are mostly insects or animals that consume both producers and then also other consumers. And then the decomposers, which are like fungi and bacteria, which break down dead matter or waste matter from the producers and the consumers and recycle those nutrients back into the system so that they can cycle all over again. So within that, we talked about the interconnected cycles of oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, because those are the things that producers, consumers, and decomposers, some of them that share throughout them. And that's how we all survive, is because we need those things. And we get them from other producers and consumers partially, whether it's how we breathe or how we consume them. And then the decomposers take those, break us down, break all the things down, and then return them back into the cycle so that they can be reused again. And we talk about biosolids in terms of a waste management tool as how we can take something like human feces and turn it into something useful, because within humans cycle, we are really bad decomposers. We are great producers and consumers, but we don't deal with our waste, deal with the things that when we're done with them very well. And so we end up with pollution and junk and garbage everywhere. And so biosolids are one way of figuring out how they could be helpful and how that could be a way to manage and become better decomposers. But there's also concerns in terms of toxicity and heavy metals and things like that within the biosolids, and how are we cycling those back into our system. So it's not a perfect idea yet, but it is something that's really interesting to look into. Then we talked about lesson 5, which was carbon footprints. And that was the measuring the amount of greenhouse gases emissions produced by individuals or organizations. We talked about how the climate justice and the impacts of this within communities in our world. So the white minority are the ones who produce the majority of greenhouse emissions, whereas the global majority are the people who are going to be impacted the most by climate change, and are having the littlest impact on creating climate change or the climate crisis. So that's an important balance to be aware of. And then we talked about reducing our carbon footprints, but also looking not only at individual impact, but looking at structural change and how that is going to have a bigger impact over the long run. And that it isn't just about individuals turning off lights or using energy efficient washing machines or things like that. That is, yes, important, but it's also about how big business and how corporations and factories and producers are changing their ways in order to create less waste or be more environmentally friendly. All right, so then looking more in detail of the more recent lessons. So lesson 6 highlights were how humanity activity affects ecosystems. Here we talk about oil spills, and we looked at both how kelp and seagrasses and other water plants die, but some algae thrives in oil spills because of they consume it, and then they become excessive, which then can block out other things that can make it environments hostile or unlivable for other plants and animals within water. We talked extensively about how animals die for the various ways in oil spills. Then we talked about how on land oil spills happen mostly due to pipe leaks, and this still has an impact on forests and lands. It is a smaller impact than if it happens in the ocean because the oil soaks into the ground more than just spreading, where it spreads on the water really, really fast and really far. But it still has an impact on the health of both land and animals and plants. Then we talked about acid precipitation and the increase of some nutrients when you have acid precipitation. That's adding some nutrients into the soil and into the environments, but it also means that we have the decrease of other nutrients, because they're washing it away and they're reacting, which means that plants and trees don't necessarily have what they need to grow strong. So they could be missing things, they could be getting too much of something, which means they don't get something else that they need, and therefore they don't grow as healthily and as strong as they would have otherwise. We also know that the lower pH levels in water are toxic to some animals, and so it can really change food chain and ecosystems, because adding more acid precipitation into these environments is lowering the pH levels of water in lakes and streams and the ocean, which some animals just can't survive at a lower. All animals have a sort of a varying degree of how low pH level that they can live in, and then this can kill them off if it's too low. Then we talk about how the recovery and that it can take years to decades for ecosystems to recover, but that we're working on the development of laws in order to protect our environments because it takes so long for things to recover and we still are having an impact. But this is definitely a long process and we haven't come to great significant benefits yet. In lesson 7, we talked about invasive species and the effects of them, how we monitor and control them. So within invasive species, we defined native species, so plants and animals that are originally from an area, and non-native species, plants and animals that come from another area, and then invasive species, which are non-native species. So they come from another area and then they take over. They just thrive in the environment and they grow and grow and grow. They produce and end up pushing out native species or becoming toxic to native species, and this is why it's concerning. So within this, humans, because native or invasive species show up because of us, they don't just show up on their own. They travel by human activity generally. So we have taken upon us to check and test for non-invasive and non-native and invasive species, so that we are aware of what's in our environments and can keep track of that. There are developments of databases so that we can predict what's likely going to happen. And if there seems to be an increase of an invasive species in an area, we can maybe try to rectify that. Or if we are noticing a change, then we are able to work towards preventing it, opposed to having to deal in a response or a reactive response. So then we talk about controlling. So once there's a situation where there is an invasive species in an area and we need to deal with it, first, we ideally would do prevention. We would make it so it didn't happen. But then if it does happen, then we have early detection and elimination. So being aware by monitoring, we're aware if it's a problem, then we can deal with it when it's a small problem, opposed to when it's a big problem. If we can eliminate, because generally we can't eliminate 100%, then it's how do we figure out how to contain it and manage it so that it's still, though it is not supposed to be there necessarily, it means that it doesn't necessarily wipe up other species. And then we talked about ecosystem restoration, which is how do we help species and ecosystems recover after invasive species have decimated them or impacted them. And lesson 8, we talked about common environmental factors. So here we talked about air pollution and the 5 major types of air pollution. So carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, hydrocarbons, and photochemical smog. So all of these things are in our air and have an impact on us humans and also other animals, as we'll talk about later. We talked about light pollution and ultraviolet light and how radiation has an impact on us as well. And noise pollution, which can lead to eventual hearing loss if we are impacted by things at too high of a level of decibels. Then we talked about soil and water pollution, specifically focusing on heavy metals, workplace chemicals, and pathogens, and how this can show up in our water and make us or other animals or even plants can be sick. So we talked about lesson 9. We talked about how these environmental contaminants enter our body. So first we had to learn about our body systems to make sure that we knew how our bodies cycle different nutrients and potentially contaminants through our bodies. So we talked about the respiratory system, so breathing and how we can inhale contaminants. We talked about the digestive system, which is eating and drinking, and how we can ingest toxins or contaminants and bring them into our body. We talked about skin and how our skin can absorb toxins or chemicals. And then we talked about the circulatory system, which is our blood system, and how once their chemicals or toxins are in our body, then the circulatory system, your blood moves those toxins around, and then that can have an impact. So that's how like something can get into your brain, even though you've been hurt on your leg or something like that. So because the toxins are moved throughout your body through your circulatory system. Then we also talked about how there are defenses, how our body can defend against small amounts of contaminants, that we are built to do that, but with too many contaminants, with excessive contaminants, that our body can't function. It doesn't have the capacity to deal with a lot of contaminants. Or also if our systems become dysfunctional due to pollution or illness, that we lose our defenses. So we have to be healthy in order for our body's defenses to work and keep us safe. And then lesson 10, the last lesson we talked about is how the human body reacts to environmental factors. So again, we talked about the respiratory, digestive, skin, circulatory, and then also lymphatic, nervous, urinary, and reproductive systems, and how each of those might get diseases through contaminants, what the contaminants are that might impact them, what the reactions and symptoms are, and how we might show up that we might be sick. And then also what the diseases are that we actually get in these various systems due to environmental factors and us ingesting, inhaling, or absorbing them. So that's what we have covered so far. It is a lot, definitely a lot. But this is why it is good to sort of be like, oh, right, yeah, we did talk about soil at the beginning. I forgot about that. We've been talking about bodies recently, but we did start talking about soil and water. And so it's just a really good, quick overview to go back and look at them again to trigger some thoughts about what we've already been studying as we continue to move on to the rest of the course. So we're going to look a little bit at some of the key questions. We're just going to talk about them. I'm not going to write things down so that you can't copy them exactly, but you can listen and sort of help trigger some thoughts about how to answer these questions. We probably won't be able to get through every single one question, so we'll sort of jump around here and there depending on depending on the timeline. So first, in lesson 6, I've got a little hummingbird here to help us remember that we're talking about lesson 6. We'll start with the ones that are more recent. So we've already done a Throwback Thursday episode with lessons 1 through 5. So instead of focusing again more heavily on those ones, we're going to focus more heavily on 6 through 10. And then if we have time, then we might look at the other ones, though we might not, because we probably won't have time. So key questions on page 46, the Check Your Understanding number 1 question is describing the effects of an oil spill on plants, mammals, and birds. So we went into this extensively in our lesson. There are details, I believe, in your workbook as well, but we looked at some pictures and we talked about various examples about how plants are impacted and how animals and birds get coated in oil, how they ingest oil and that poisons them, how their food sources can be eliminated because their food source dies due to the oil. So we went over that question a fair amount. Then on page 48, questions 1 and 2, suppose a local lake has undergone acidification. What does this mean? So we haven't actually used the word acidification too much in our lessons, but thinking about if we break that word up, if we don't know the definition exactly, so it's useful to sort of be able to break things up. And that looks like acid. So acidification to me feels like something that's turning into an acid. So if we look it up in the glossary of our workbook, it says acidification is an increase in acidity of water and soil caused by acid precipitation. So that makes sense. That's sort of what I was getting at. So what does it mean if your local lake has undergone acidification? So it's become more acidic. And so what is that going to mean? And then 2, describe 3 ways soils can be changed because of acid precipitation. And again, we talked about this in our lesson, so we have covered that material. So the review questions on page 51, questions 1 through 12. So we're just going to, I'm going to look at them over. So number 1, describe 1 way oil enters an ecosystem accidentally and 1 way an oil enters an ecosystem intentionally. So it's really good to pay attention to the fact that yes, it does happen accidentally, and there's lots of oil spills where accidents happen, tankers, things happen, explosions happen, but also we've talked about how they can be introduced intentionally as well. So then on number 2, where you're going to create an illustration that compares the relative volumes of the Exxon Valdez oil spill to an average school gym, house, classroom, and living room. All of it, that is listed on table 2.2. It gives you the relative amounts and also the relative numbers. So this question is just asking you to create a drawing. And I am not an amazing artist at all. So I'm not expecting this to be incredible, detailed, spends hours and hours on creating these drawings. No, this is just a general idea so that you can get an idea of how big the oil spill was compared to each of these things, so that you sort of have a visual to understand that. And then just answering questions, that's just looking up information. What is the difference between an oil slick and a tar ball? So again, off the top of my head, I'm blanking on what a tar ball is. So I am going to look it up. So in your glossary, here it says tar balls are small, dark colored pieces of oil that wash up on the beaches after an oil spill. Whereas an oil slick is the thick oil that is on top of the water when it is spilled. So you can draw your conclusions about how those two are different. Then using figure 2.13, create a table describing the 7 natural actions that will break up oil spilled. So explain how naturally the world deals with oil spills. Because oil spills could happen naturally, right? Like it isn't just us drilling or us dumping oil into the water or ground. They could, in theory, ooze up and happen naturally. But probably it's not at the rate we make it more aggressive, and therefore it's hard for nature to deal with it. Whereas if it was just happening naturally, then the environment, the natural environment, would be able to deal with it, and it wouldn't have as much of an impact, I assume. Then number 6, what is the difference between episodic and chronic acidification? So remember, episodic is like episodes, and chronic is like chronic. I think of it like chronic illness is what comes to my mind. So episodic is like short, and chronic is long. So number 10, why is Ontario one of the provinces hardest hit by acid precipitation? So you got to think about in terms of what industries do really well in Ontario, and what are we putting into the air? Cool. So that is some general topics of or questions for lesson 6. So let's move on to lesson 7. On page 55, check your understanding questions 1 through 3. So what are the criteria for a living thing to be a native species? We've talked about this both in the lesson 7, and also I've mentioned it again today. So hopefully you know what defines a native species. If not, look in your workbook, either in the glossary or in lesson 7. When 2 or more native species require the same food or habitat, what is the struggle for these resources called? Give some examples of the struggle. So this I remember in your workbook being, so I'm not going to say it so that you can look it up, but if things are competing for the same food source or habitat, what is that called? And can you give any examples of where that might be? So that might take a little bit of thought. It might not be something that you can pull exactly out of our lessons or the workbook. You might need to think about that a little bit more, or do a little bit more research. And what is the difference between a predator and a prey? We didn't talk about this exactly. I think that those words are fairly common, and you can look them up, the definitions, if you're unsure. But in terms of invasive species, you can think about that relationship between predator and prey. If you think back to the video of the loosestrife and the beetle, whose name I don't remember, the beetle would be the predator and the loosestrife would be the prey kind of idea in that terms of that relationship. And then on page 57, check your understanding number 1. What occurs when an area or region is monitored for invasive and native species? So this is just giving a general idea of that process of monitoring and controlling an area. So how does that work? Then this is one unit where you have, or one lesson where you have an activity to do. So activity 2.5. And where you're going to, we talked about this in lesson 7, in our lesson 7 video. We went through a little bit of how you're going to complete this table of figuring out the percentages of purple loosestrife and how much of it is covered by purple loosestrife and how much of the area is not covered. And what does that mean? So this is like talking about, or getting us to sort of visualize and understand the impacts of this invasive species, which now is more under control. But still, if the beetles aren't introduced into the environment, what would happen for purple loosestrife? And then the review questions on page 59, 1 through 11. So talking about why numbers have continued to increase of non-native species over the past 200 years. So why do we keep just getting more and more? Defining what a non-native or alien species is, and what's the difference between an alien species and an invasive species. Remember, we're thinking about plants and animals and science and not like science fiction, though I do love science fiction. Number 5, how predators can help to control a population of invasive species. That's an interesting one to think about in terms of going back to that beetle and purple loosestrife. And then here, number 6, how does an invasive species like purple loosestrife impact the biodiversity of a region? So this is partially thinking about it. So now, again, purple loosestrife is getting to be more in control in Ontario, but thinking about the impacts before we were able to get it under control, and the same way that other places or other things might not be under control in the same way. So what is the impacts of having an invasive species? Thinking about it as an economic issue, or basic methods of controlling the entry or spread of invasive species. So we talked about that briefly today, but we definitely talked about that extensively in our video. Give an example of how more than one method of control can be used at the same time. So though I didn't do this exactly, there was a flow chart in terms of the cycle of how to deal with invasive species. And so you could think about that a little bit deeply in terms of how you could be potentially doing more than one thing at a time and how that might be beneficial. Describe one method of controlling purple loosestrife. You should be comfortable with that, as I've mentioned it multiple times and we watched a video about it. And then what do you think would happen if the control process failed after all other methods of control were used? So what's the outcome going to be if nothing works? And that is lesson 7 and invasive species. All right, lesson 8, page 65, check your understanding. Number 1, what are the 5 major air pollutants that result from human activities? This we went over extensively in our video, and I also mentioned them again today. So you're just listing off those things. They're also in your workbook. And on page 67, number 1, what are the 3 common contaminants in soil and water? So we went over this, and it's in your workbook as well. So hopefully that's just listening that information. So on page 67, the review questions. So list the top 3 sources of emissions in Canada and the percentage of emissions they each produce. So this you're going to have to look up. This isn't something that is going to be directly in our workbook, because our workbook is, I think, from 2010. So our workbook is already 12 years old. So that information may have changed. So you might need to do a little bit of research about that. How is carbon monoxide naturally produced? Talked about this. Name 3 technological devices that produce carbon monoxide. And then again, what are the majority of sulfur emissions from Canada come from? So where do they come from, and how are they, all of these pollutants we're talking about, where do they come from and how do they interact in our environments, and how do they interact with each other? So that talks about, might help you with the 5 major air pollutants. Just those questions right there, 1 through 8. Then we watched a video about the electromagnetic radiation and the electromagnetic spectrum, so how those are different. And we talked about nanometers and meters and radiation waves. So that's all we talked about in the video. So you go back and watch those videos from NASA if you'd like. Why is the ozone beneficial to humans? And where is ozone harmful? So that's a really interesting question in terms of that we do need our ozone. That is really important to us, but if we are breathing it in, it's really not good for us. So interesting to think about the benefits and the concerns of particular things. Create a pie chart on a separate sheet of paper to illustrate the data in table 3.1 that shows the percentage contribution of global warming of the 4 major greenhouse gases. When you're creating a pie chart, you does not need to be precise. You don't need to use a compass and a protractor. We haven't having a rough idea, and if you want to use those tools and make it pretty close, that is fine. It is okay if you do generalization or use a computer instead of doing it out by hand and doing it exactly right. I am not going to measure your slices of your pie in order to see if they are accurate in their percentage ratios, but I am going to look at it and see if it makes sense, but it doesn't have to be exactly right. Then compare and contrast noise pollution and air pollutants, which are interesting. We didn't talk about noise pollution a lot, but we definitely did talk about it. So it's interesting to think about those other pollutants. And then describe the characteristics of 3 workplace chemicals as they have an impact on our bodies and our environments. Okay, lesson 9. So lesson 9 on page 71, so check your understanding 1 and 2. What's the difference between inhalation and exhalation? So in breathing. And 2, what is the difference between trachea and bronchial tubes? We definitely talked about both the trachea and bronchial tubes. We defined them. We looked at images. We looked at videos. So hopefully you can figure that out or look it up. On page 74, number 1 and 2, what's the difference between ingestion and digestion? Again, we talked about that. And how does saliva assist in digestion? Again, we talked about that in terms of looking at diagrams and in our videos as well. So our review questions on page 77, 1 through 13. Create a flow chart showing the respiratory structure airs must pass through from your nose to the capillaries. So you're just going to show using arrows. It doesn't have to be super fancy. Just show where air starts and all of the different structures, organs, systems that it goes through in your respiratory system. These I'm just looking at them. And we talked about them, and then we talked about the videos too. So those are all really helpful to go back to if you want. What other organs assist the small intestine in digesting your food? So we went to great detail about the mouth, the teeth, the saliva glands, the esophagus, the stomach, the liver, the pancreas, the gallbladder, the small intestine, the large intestine, the rectum, the anus. That's a whole big, long digestive system. It's got a lot of different parts. And so how do they help? How do some of the other organs assist the small intestines? Not all of them are directly related, but some of them, a couple of them are directly related to the small intestine. Where does most of your food get absorbed into your bloodstream and transported to the cells in your body? How do the nutrients get into your bloodstream? So thinking about those, all the really, really large surface area, so that your body is able to extract all the nutrients from your food. And then what structure helps increase the surface area available for absorption? This relates exactly to that in terms of what are the little crevices and little bumps that make it so that there's more area for your body to absorb those nutrients. Describe the role of the large intestine. I mean, we talked about it. These are fairly, hopefully straightforward questions in terms of we talked about them. They're in your workbook in terms of you can read them. We watched videos. So hopefully those multiple points of entry make it so that these questions make sense. We've covered them. Then we talk about vomiting and why our body vomits. Then in what ways does the body's skin act as a first layer of defense against contaminants? What are the 3 layers of human skin and what are each of the function layers? Again, we talked about this. We watched the videos. We looked at diagrams and what types of substances can be absorbed through the skin. Again, we talked about that. So we've talked about all these questions in our videos. In like our lessons and between the videos and the diagrams and the text, both in my lessons and in the workbook. So hopefully these questions can all seem accessible. And then our final lesson 10 on page 79, check your understanding 1 and 2. What are the most common contaminant that affect your respiratory system? So remember that we had a chart that we looked at the contaminants. So what showed up most often? And what digestive diseases can result from workplace chemicals? So then going the opposite way, looking at the contaminant of the workplace chemicals and what diseases show up due to them in your digestion. Page 81, check your understanding 1 and 2. What's the most common reaction your skin will have if it comes in contact with a contaminant? So looking at that chart and seeing what reaction shows up the most often. And 2, describe 2 living things that can enter the circulatory system and infect humans. So that one might be a little bit interesting in terms of thinking about living things. When I think of living things, automatically my brain is like mice. No, that's not what it means, but it isn't just chemical or heavy metal or something like that, or gas like oxygen, or well, that's anyway. What other living things? So thinking about the other things that might get into your system that are going to affect and in fact make people sick. So then our review questions on page 85. If a person has pneumonia, what symptoms might you observe? That's just looking on the chart. If an older person has emphysema, what contaminants might be responsible for this disease? Again, looking at the chart. What disease could asbestos and ionization radiation cause? Again, looking at the chart. If listeria grows at refrigerator temperatures, why aren't more people infected with the bacterium? So that's an interesting question that isn't directly on the chart. You're going to have to think about that a little bit of why we don't get sick just by listeria, why bacteria growing in our fridge. Number 5, a person returns from a hiking trip and visits the doctor complaining of intestinal pain, vomiting, and watery diarrhea. What disease might this person have? So looking at the chart and seeing where those symptoms are and why they might have gotten them. What conditions could give rise to melanoma? Again, looking at the chart. A person diagnosed with cancer may be treated with ionizing radiation. What is one symptom they may experience as a result of this treatment? So thinking about, generally talked about in terms of cancer treatment, that radiation is one way of dealing with cancer cells. And then people talk about the symptoms and how the radiation makes them sick outside of the cancer making them sick. So looking at the chart about what those symptoms might be. How does the spleen protect the lymphatic system? We talked about this directly in our lesson, and it's in your workbook as well. Number 9, your friend is returning from Africa and experiences fever, chills, and sweating. The doctor diagnoses her with malaria. What organism is responsible for this disease? We've talked about that too. 10, what 3 organs and structures make up your nervous system? We looked at a diagram so you can see that in terms of what your nerves are. If the nervous system is contained within the body, how can contaminants influence the system? So that makes sense in terms of thinking about how do we get, our nervous system is all inside, doesn't touch anything of contaminants on the outside. So how does things impact our nervous system if it isn't exposed to the natural environment? What the question's asking. So that's, think about the interconnectedness of the various systems. How does the workplace chemical affect the male reproductive system and the female reproductive system? So we talked about that, and there's a chart. So mostly the chart is your friend. Okay, so we have gone over all of the lessons 6 through 10. So we're not going to go over, we don't have time to go over the questions from lesson 1 through 5. We did that before in our previous Throwback Thursday. So go back and check out that other video. If you have any questions or you want to chat about any of the parts for this lesson, feel free to reach out, please. This is what I'm here for. We're getting crunch time in terms of our course is done June 10th, and all of your work needs to be submitted before June 10th in order for me to grade it and get it back to you so you can do your final culminating and get your course credit. So folks who've been working on the credit for a while, is great and totally fine. But if you want to actually earn your credit this year, you need to start handing stuff in so that I can get you work back and you can be earning it opposed to just learning it in general. If you want to call me and talk to me, 807-737-1488, extension 2209 is how to reach me at the office, or toll free 1-800-667-3703. My email address is bronwyn.slate, which is spelled BRONWYN.SLATE@nnec.on.ca. My Facebook is bslate Wahsa, and this will be uploaded to bslate Wahsa on YouTube as well as all of our other lessons. My office hours are Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. So reach out to me so that we can get you through the course, as it's getting down to be crunch time and we want you to all be successful. Thanks so much for joining me today. Which